Hi, thanks for being patient. There might be people coming in because the tram stopped working, so they might be making their way up the hill. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge that the Getty is situated on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tongva people. And I wanted to suggest that if you wanted to find out more about Tongva history in what is now West LA, to visit Kuruvungna Sacred Springs on Barrington Avenue, which is only about 15 minutes from the Getty. So thanks so much for coming to this conversation, Women Artists Experiment with Xerox. We are here to celebrate Barbara T. Smith's exhibition, Barbara T. Smith, The Way to Be, by taking a deeper dive into just one of the ways that Barbara was a trailblazer, her use of Xerox. I hope you've all had a chance to see the exhibition, but if you haven't, we'll be doing walkthroughs after the event. The exhibition will be up until July 16th, so I hope if you don't have a chance to see it today, then you'll still have time to see it. We acquired the archive in 2014, as well as a major set of unique Xerox artist books called The Coffins, and you can see some of that work in the exhibition. As has been a kind of law by now, in 1966, Barbara T. Smith leased the Xerox machine, Xerox 914, and used it in her dining room for a 9-month period of intensive experimentation. To put her work in the broader context of women experimenters with the medium, we've invited the scholars and curators Michelle Donnelly and Taous Dahmani to discuss the work of Joan Lyons and Rita Keegan. It's a very informal conversation, and we all have some slides, and Pietro Rigolo is going to talk about Barbara's work. Although the three artists who are the focus of today's conversation were not in contact with one another, the parallels and divergences between their works in different contexts, LA, London, and Rochester, and across 3 decades, will, I hope, provide us with inspiration for our conversation. Some of the topics we hope to touch upon are about the gendering of technology, the connection to print, photography, and performance, multiplicity in reproduction, and marginalization. The conversation is but a tiny sliver of ongoing research from the project Xerography in Women Artists, 1960s to 1980s, which I lead at the Getty in collaboration with Judith Delphinaire of the University of Paris, Nanterre. That will result in a book in the coming years. If your interest is piqued, please follow the project through the GRI's website. I mentioned that there are tours after this talk. We're also having 2 more events for the exhibition. On June the 10th, we're going to have a Xerox workshop with the artist Camila Janan Rashid, who's a contemporary artist that has explored Xerox in her work. And on July 8th, we'll be celebrating Barbara's birthday. That's a bit of a surprise event there. At the box, what was that? Is online. This coming week at the Box Gallery at 6 p.m., so that's on May the 11th, so this Thursday, there's going to be a walkthrough of the exhibition Treasures, which is also focused on Barbara T. Smith and her circle. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and just the last thanks to our AV team, thank you, Chelsea Anderson for helping organize, and to Judith and all the other Xerox collaborators from afar, who I hope will watch this later. So we're going to hear from Pietro first, who will be talking about Barbara's work, then Michelle, and then Taous. So I'm going to introduce them in turn all at once now, and then we'll just follow through the presentations. So Pietro Rigolo is Associate Curator at the Getty Research Institute. He's the co-curator of Barbara T. Smith, The Way to Be. And in 2018, he co-curated the GRI exhibition, Harold Zeman, Museum of Obsessions. Michelle Donnelly is a PhD candidate at the History of Art at Yale. Her dissertation explores how women artists and artists of color expanded the parameters of printmaking outside the traditional site of the workshop from 1935 to 75, As a curatorial fellow at the Whitney Museum, she curated experiments in electrostatics, photocopy art from the Whitney's collection, 1966 to 1986. Taous Dahmani is a French, British, and Algerian art historian, writer, and curator, specializing in photography. Her projects explore the links between photography and politics, including the visual culture of protests, migratory narratives, and intersectional feminist discourses. Dahmani is the editor for The Eyes magazine, a trustee of the Photo Oxford Festival, and is on the editorial board of MIA, Visual Culture and Feminism. She's also associate lecturer at the University of London, London College of Communication. So with those intros, I'd like to invite Pietro to come up. We're going to have 3 short presentations, and then we're going to engage in a conversation, and hopefully Barbara will agree to join us on the carpet for that discussion. Thanks, Pietro.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Zanna. Thank you, Chelsea, and all the team here at the Getty. Thank you, Michelle and Taous, for making it here, and thank you, all of you, for being here today, especially Barbara. It's been an honor to have you here today. So in the exhibition, you'll have the opportunity to see a selection of the coffin books Barbara Smith produced with the Xerox 1914 machine. I thought I'd use this opportunity today to present, though, the other major body of work that came out from that moment of experimentation, a series of poetry sets which are also part of her archive. And this will give me the opportunity also to read some of Barbara's poetry of that time, which is truly, truly beautiful. The idea to develop her poetry further with illustration was the main reason, actually, Smith listed the 914 in the first place, together with the idea of creating some sculptures, which we won't have time to analyze today. The archive here at the GRI has a massive amount of preparatory material for the poetry sets and virtually none for the coffin books. This can be explained by the fact that she laboriously worked on the poetry sets, whereas the coffin books were made somewhat in haste at the very end of this hectic period of experimentation, with the photocopies that were accumulated in her house. It is therefore clear that the poetry sets are the true laboratory where the different possibilities of the machine were tested out. Here, with this small selection of pages from some of the coffin books in the show, you can get an idea of the different sources and methodologies that are at play in the books. Smith works with pre-existing family pictures, carries out actions on top of the glass plate, uses photography that she commissioned specifically for the books, and objects are placed directly on the plate. Contrary to the coffin books, the poetry sets are for the most part a series of loose sheets, bearing one poem each and kept together in envelopes. Here, for example, we see the different sheets comprising a set called Joy. As you can see, all the different ways to use the machine and the techniques adopted with the coffin books are already here, with a major difference. The main feature that make the poetry sets poetry is, of course, text, authored by Smith, and the relationship between text and image is important, an aspect that virtually disappears in the coffin books. Here I am showing an example of preparatory material for a single poem called Birth. We can follow the composition of the sheet and the creative process in Barbara's dining room, probably starting with this pencil sketch of a hand holding, maybe pulling a baby, and this poem that I will read. Quote, "That ancient, distant memory feeling of distortion, extension without limit, terror and dread at our absolute vulnerability, the need for feeling, sensuality, excitement to know we are at all. Birth becomes confinement exploded, our first instant of madness, utter fragmentation that cries for definition. Creatures and monsters are on every side, until we know they care," unquote. From here, we can see how the initial sketch is developed further, how consideration about the color of the paper to use come into play, as well as first attempts at placing the text, which then become more and more complex with the overlaying of different fonts and sizes and color, until some somewhat final decisions are taken in terms of color and composition, and then we reach the final version here. Besides the disappearance of the text, another main aspect that differentiates the poetry sets from the coffin books is of course the fact that the sheets are loose, not bound together in a fixed sequence. A few examples, though, shows us early attempts at sequencing in quite interesting and surprising ways. In these examples, in which two sheets can be flipped at the top, Smith uses a punch hole and a thread, here a little red sticker, here a tiny little nail, here a pin with a pearly tip, and here she staples the pages at the top. This in particular is a poem Smith seems to get back to over and over again, rework in different pieces, and we could draw some connections with her Christmas cards, which are quite significant, and you can read about in the book as well as in the exhibition. And I'll read this poem, quote, "In the spaces around love, there shines a burning rabbit, nibbling at the moon, whose cocoon he swallowed in an instant, breathing the breath of Christmas fire." Unquote. And then we have this amazing example of staple sheets that have to be lifted up against the light in order to reveal the text on the sheet underneath, thus somewhat mimicking the process of photocopying itself. So I have been asking myself, when did these other heaps of photocopies become book, and how exactly Barbara got the idea of books without words? Why would you get rid of words if you want to make books? And what artist books could she have looked at that time? I thought Ed Rocher could of course be an antecedent Smith knew about and would have looked at. By 1965, Rocher had already published some of his notorious books, such as Various Small Fires and Milk and Some Los Angeles Apartments. We know the two knew each other and were both in the orbit of Walter Hopes and the Pasadena Art Museum. Furthermore, Jerry McMillan, the photographer, who was shooting for Rocher at that time, shot some of the pictures Smith used in the coffin books. I had the opportunity to talk to Barbara about all this, and she confirmed she and her husband were collecting at that time and did own some of Rocher's early books. There weren't any other really to look at, but she also kept stressing how Rocher's books were completely different and how the idea to work with Xerox came from the exposure to prints in the collection of the Pasadena Art Museum, where she was a volunteer, rather than from thinking about books. Her thinking about the printing process, her intention to produce a print, and the experience of being rejected at the Gemini GEL would indeed be the reason why she tried to get hold of a Xerox machine in the first place. I want to conclude my remarks by showing you another set of loose Xerox sheets, which Barbara put together towards the end of her experimentation with the machine, and that she called the ladder, and later reworked in a small artist book called Coffin in Self-Defense. In May 1967, Smith had the opportunity to travel to New York for the first time, where she met Robert Morris and his then wife, Yvonne Rainer. Morris, who already had quite a reputation for ripping off other artists, seemed particularly interested in her stories about what she was doing with the Xerox machine. Back in Pasadena, Smith recounted the meeting with Morris to Walter Hopes, who suggested her to write a dated and signed letter in which she presented her experimentation. Out of this letter was born, an attempt to reach out and to mark the territory. At the same time, the letter offers samplings of all she had done with the machine up until then, and it is interesting because it decidedly shifts the focus from text to image. Language, as you can see, is used in a totally different way. We have only one or two tiny words at the center of each page, spelling out, "I thought you might like to see some of my work on the Xerox machine. So we can see how the juxtaposition of words and images here often lead to ironic and comic effects, which are not that present in the poetry nor in the coffin books. Like, for example, the play on words I, meaning myself, and I, E-Y-E, you, having picture of herself, to see, showing again an eye and some anatomical diagrams, some presenting tools of measure and other means to calculate, of my bringing up copying, both as a technological process and maybe a hint at often male artists copying other often female artists, and then signing the whole thing as the resident manager. So to conclude, it seems like the time Smith spent with the Xerox machine allowed her to experiment first and foremost with herself, to use art in a transformative way, as she would keep doing for the rest of her career with her performances. From rejection to finding a public, finding somebody to speak to a certain self-awareness and confidence that allowed her to use humor and irony in respect to her own work and her own position in the art world. Thanks for listening. And now I'll leave the stage to Michelle Donnelly.
Okay. Thank you, Zanna, for the introduction. Thank you, Barbara, for joining us tonight. And thank you, Chelsea, for all of your work in organizing today's event. I am excited to speak with you all about the work of Barbara T. Smith and Joan Lyons, who are two artists I've been thinking about for a long time. As Zanna mentioned, I curated an exhibition at the Whitney Museum in 2017 on artists who use the copy machine as a hybrid camera printing press. And both Barbara and Joan installed a Xerox machine in the space of their homes in the 1960s, and they used it to explore their most readily available subject, their own bodies. However, they created radically different works because of their access to different Xerox technologies. So in this short presentation, I'm going to unpack how they each exploited the distinct capabilities of their copy machine in order to explore the female nude. And before I begin, I also want to make a quick plug that Joan Lyons has a solo show on view at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester right now, on view through August 2023, so I recommend you check it out. So Barbara leased the Xerox 914, which was the first automatic plain paper copier that came out in 1959. It's on view in the exhibition. And as you can see in this advertisement, it was an L-shaped desk. You would place the item to be copied on top of the glass flatbed, underneath which was a lens. The user would press the print button, a light bar would scan the document, and then after just a few seconds, a copy would emerge. As you can also see in this image, it hit just below most people's hips at 30 inches high, so it was the perfect height for artists to want to lay their bodies on top of it. And Barbara has discussed how she envisioned creating prints in collaboration with her husband, in which they would each take turns placing their naked bodies on the surface of the machine. At the time, their relationship was deteriorating. She was feeling entrapped in her domestic role, and she was longing for a sense of intimacy. So she fantasized about creating this erotic imagery in which the machine would act as an intermediary between their two bodies. Her husband rejected this proposal, but she decided to go ahead without him and use the copier to explore her sexuality. So as Pietro mentioned, these are images from her Coffin series. These are just two of those books in which a black cover opens up into this accordion fold of images. And each image offers a closely cropped view of her body in increasing states of undress. From the limitations of the flatbed, you also get a sense of the containment and entrapment that she was feeling in the domestic sphere at this time in Pasadena. The flatbed was designed for standard-sized business documents at 9 by 14 inches. So we can see in these images how Barbara is awkwardly contorting her body to fit within this tight spatial frame. She is pressing her body against the flatbed, which in turn is, compressing back and distorting her body. So it's really expressing the sense of containment and entrapment that she was feeling in the domestic sphere. But at the same time, this is also a space of liberation for her. And I think that we get a sense of that feeling of sexual liberation from her serial layout of the images. So they're arranged in the order that she created them. Presented edge to edge like a film strip, these images essentially reanimate her bodily movements. So she becomes a subject in motion rather than a subject who is merely entrapped on the page. Joan Lyons also used a Xerox machine to picture her body in the space of her home, whereas Barbara put it in her dining room, Joan installed it in her home studio. But she wasn't seeking to create conventional self-portraits in which she is an identifiable subject. Instead, she used her body as a site to investigate feminine archetypes or generic characters that have recurred in visual and literary culture. So on the left, she is posing as the huntress with her searching eyes and active stance. In the center, she's embodying the witch with her suspicious stare. And on the right, she is personifying the temptress with her chest bare and legs open like a centerfold model. While Barbara was based in California, Joan lived in Rochester, New York, which was the home of Xerox headquarters. And from her local connections, she was able to get hold of an obsolete Xerox copying system that was no longer readily available. It was called the Haloid Xerox Standard Equipment, and it was the original Xerox system from 1948. It was composed of 4 units, a copy board, a camera, a processor, and a heat fuser. Unlike Barbara's copier, it did not have a glass flatbed for you to lay documents on. It instead operated upright like a view camera. It also wasn't automatic. You couldn't just press print. Instead, you had to conduct 50 manual procedures to create a single copy. So I'm just going to very quickly walk us through this process. As the woman from the operating manual illustrates for us, first, Joan slid a selenium plate into the processor, and she pressed the charge button to make it light sensitive. Next, she transferred the plate from the processor to the camera, and she held a pose in front of the lens for approximately 10 seconds. Then she moved the plate to the developing tray in the processor, repeatedly rotating the tray to evenly cascade developer beads coated with a carbon black powder called toner across the plate. The exposed areas of the plate rejected the toner, while the unexposed positive charged areas attracted the toner. Then she laid a sheet of paper atop the developed image, reinserted the plate into the processor, and flipped the transfer switch to make the paper attract the toner. Finally, she lifted the photocopy from the plate. At this point, though, the toner was not yet bonded to the paper. It can still be manipulated like a charcoal drawing. It wasn't until she placed it in the heat fuser that it permanently adhered to the surface. So as you can see, this was a highly complicated process, but because it was manual, she was able to create a series of interventions into her imagery that she couldn't have done in an automated machine. Before she placed it in the heat fuser, so while the toner was still loose and malleable, she used a tool called a hot wire to manipulate her imagery. This, as we can imagine, was not endorsed by Xerox. It was an independent invention by her colleague Joel Schwartz, who was also an artist based in Rochester, and he worked independently with a Xerox engineer named Robert Gunlack. So through their guidance, she connected a wire tipped with a metal needle to the charge rail of the processor, and then she used this implement to harness volts of electricity to shock the unfixed toner off the page and onto another surface. I unfortunately don't have pictures of Joan using this tool, but I do have pictures of her colleague Tom Carpenter using it from a workshop that we organized. So as we can see on the screen, after Tom pulled the photocopy from the plate, he placed it face down on a blank sheet of paper, and then he used the hot wire to transfer the toner from the top sheet to the bottom sheet. So it created this mirror image, leaving behind some residue like a ghost print. So whereas Barbara was limited to 9 by 14-inch sheets of paper because of the automated system, Joan was able to quite literally break her figures out of the confines of the standard size sheet. So she created this work by transferring and recombining multiple prints of her body onto a large sheet of drawing paper using the hot wire. As part of her broader aims, she was curious how the female nude could be transformed through the gaze of a woman artist. Like many feminists in the 1970s, she had become increasingly aware of how women had been traditionally portrayed in the history of art as passive objects on display for the pleasure of the viewer. And she sought to challenge this through the use of the hot wire, by deconstructing and reconstructing her body. So here we can see how she is conjoining two different prints of her bent legs. We can actually see the edges of the one print right here. And so by doing this, her legs seem strangely linked with her hips, and her genitals seem oddly askew, attached at a different angle than the rest of her body. Her face also appears shattered. She has 2 mouths and 3 eyes, with one hovering in the center of her forehead. So her body doesn't appear intact and whole, but shifting and oscillating. Her body defies easy visual consumption. So she is not submissively surrendering to the gaze of the viewer, but forcefully looking back. So both Barbara T. Smith and Joan Lyons reimagined the possibilities of an administrative device to explore the subject of the female nude. Neither of them passively put their bodies on display, but they were active subjects who investigated their bodies on their own terms. There's a lot more to say about these works, but I will leave it here for now, and I look forward to thinking through these practices with all of you. So thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on such a nice and sunny day. I would like to start by thanking Zanna and Pietro for the invitation to speak today, and the incredible opportunity to be able to share Keegan's work here at the Getty today. And I guess I'll just jump right in with my introduction. In the spring of 2019, after a few exchanges via Facebook, the only way I had then found to connect with her, Rita Keegan invited me to meet her at her home in Vauxhall in South London to talk about her life and her multiple artistic practices. When the moment came for her to show me her Xerox art, the reason why I had contacted her in the first place, she proceeded to retrieve folders from behind the sofa where we were sitting. For decades, her living room had been the informal location of her personal archive. It was in this rather unorthodox context that for the first time I saw, manipulated and photographed Rita's xerographic work as she was sitting in the corner of her velvet sofa by the bay window, telling me stories about her life between New York and San Francisco in the 60s and 70s and her subsequent move to London in 1980. Today, my presentation will merge account of her life and practice, since the facts of her biography and artistic endeavor still remain under research and thus little known, focusing on her xerographic work in the mid-1980s. So I'll start with a tale of her transatlantic journey. Born in the Bronx in 1949 to a Dominican mother and an African-Canadian father, Rita Keegan went to the High School of Art and Design in Midtown Manhattan. If most of her early life was spent on the East Coast, Keegan left for the West Coast for her undergrad training. In 1969, she studied at the San Francisco Art Institute, from where she graduated in 1972. After having followed the teaching of American photographer Imogen Cunningham, African-American painter Mary Lovelace O'Neill, and African-American assemblage artist Betty Saar. For the young Rita Keegan, these artists, and especially O'Neill and Saar, offered the freedom of putting herself in the center of the frame and doing so through experimentation with a multiple of mediums. Indeed, at the San Francisco Art Institute, Keegan painted, designed, and made garments. Early on, as a result of her education, Keegan did not conceive of hierarchies between her practice as a painter and her fashion-related endeavors, giving us early pointers to her non-interest in traditional or conservative distinctions between visual arts and crafts and any kind of art-related pyramid of value. Two other elements persuaded Rita Keegan as early as her childhood of the possibility of becoming an artist, even while growing up in segregated USA. First, her early knowledge of the Harlem Renaissance, and then her relationship with her uncle, Keith Simon, born in 1922 and passed away in 2013, a Howard-educated Caribbean painter, member of the Caribbean arts movement, who had an exhibition in 1971 at the Commonwealth Institute in London. However, despite the positive start as a young artist, considering the socio-political context of the States, Rita Keegan struggled to find her place in the New York and Californian art scenes, and as a result, decided to move to London in 1980. A second-class citizen in her country of origin, she discovered her Americanness in Margaret Thatcher's England and quickly made friends with the artists of the emerging Black British scene. During our conversation, Rita Keegan described her arrival as England as such, and I'm quoting her here. Being here meant I got to be American for the first time. Being American was fascinating because culture trumps race, end of quote. As she experienced another kind of race relations in London at a moment when Black British citizens were fighting for their rights and freedom, Keegan also encountered the British art establishment's rules and regulation. And she explained, and I'm quoting her again here. In the States, if you can put it on the wall or a plinth, it's art. Then they can sell it. I did not grow up artistically in a world that had hierarchies of making, whereas in Europe, it is very entrenched in what art is, end of quote. Despite normative and conservative European constraints, her life in London in the early 1980s was both alternative and radical. She was taking part in feminist CR groups, teaching white feminists about the intersection of struggles, was partying in Soho, where a mixologist even named a cocktail after her. And in 1981, she helped establish the Brixton Art Gallery, where she curated the show Mirror Reflecting Darkly, displaying only works by Black British women artists. As an organizer of diverse events, from parties to exhibitions, Keegan first used copying to produce modest exhibition catalogues, pamphlets, and posters for the Brixton Art Gallery. This is how, in 1983, she discovered community copy art, then still a traveling endeavor providing mobile workshops with a single photocopier and a van. In 1984, Keegan helped Copy Art get established in a building in King Cross with support from the Camden Council and Greater London Arts. Copy Art functioned as a co-op with 7 part-time posts, one of them being filled by Rita Keegan herself. Considered by its founders as, and I'm quoting here, a structure of resistance, Copy Art became a means of building an oppositional public space. It offered the possibility of making reasonably priced photocopies, both for community associations and activist organizations, as well as for young artists exploring the possibilities of copying. For the young creative, the crucial difference between Copy Art and any other copy shops was the freedom to handle the machines themselves and have access to a wide variety of materials. As Keegan said, and I'm quoting her again here, if you have access to it, you are going to do stuff to it, end of quote. In 1984, Keegan began a long period of work using a Canon NP 2010 photocopier with 5 toners of blue, red, green, brown, and black inks. Free access to a color copier offered her the opportunity to explore the art of montage. Armed with a T-Pex, Pritt stick, and X-Acto knife, Keegan's montages were composed and constructed with the expertise and delicacy she knew through sewing and dressmaking. Affordable and transportable, Xerox art did not require a studio or a permanent place to live. As a result, this DIY attitude inherent to the Xerox art ought not to be considered as an aesthetic choice only, but a real driving ethic. Keegan's Xerox art was a celebration of poor productions, to cite Rita Keegan. And she told me, and I'm quoting her again here, "I have no problem with people's media because people need a voice," end of quote. Even if limited to A4 and A3 formats, Keegan produced a multiple of collages, experimenting with layering, composition, and color. However, Keegan's Xerox practice chiefly focused on the representation of the self. Rita Keegan's art of immediacy, as she names it herself, may be understood as a search for individuality within haptic and emotional multiplicities. Her Xerox work is a way for looking for uniqueness in replicas. Keegan's Xerox art is dedicated to the appropriation of photographs of herself and her family. Indeed, in addition to her flamboyant outfits in the suitcases she brought with her from America, were family photographs of her middle-class black family dating back to the early 1900s. Keegan explained that, and I'm quoting her again, "Photographs were part of the fabric of my childhood," end of quote. Keegan's montage were a way of exploring her paternal roots, which date back to the time of the Underground Railroad used by slaves to escape to Canada, merging this narrative with her Caribbean roots from her mother's side. As writer and curator Naomi Pierce explained, and I'm quoting Naomi here, Rita used a photocopier as a time-traveling device, drawing together what had been kept apart, end of quote. She used and reused countless of times the same pictures from her family album. And where there is repetition, there is insistence, making Keegan's self-portraits fundamentally political as an assertion of herself as a black woman artist. Playing with notions of time and space, Keegan art incorporated family photographs and engages the viewer with her presentation of the diasporic family archive as a confirmation of existence and endurance, a refusal to be erased, situating her family within the narratives of modernity. Keegan's montage also gave a framework of her visual references. Her Xerox art is not only an art of copying, but an art of repetition and variations. Beyond the work on family photos, Keegan used a tight iconography with the recurrence of two main motifs, flowers and shells. Flowers as a motif were evidently inspired by Frida Kahlo's self-portraits, which she admired as her 1988 homage to Frida Kahlo attests to. If the Mexican painter known for her many self-portraits is an obvious reference for Keegan's own practice of self-representation, Kahlo's iconography, inspired by South American nature and flora, evidently influenced Keegan's montages. Moreover, Kahlo's interest in the depiction of her own family and roots must have had an impact on Keegan's reflection. But I would like to sort of draw another parallel with Barbara T. Smith's Xerox work in the late 60s, using also her face and her body as key element of the composition, but also more recent work where flowers take central stage. Visiting the Getty exhibition, The Way to Be, this morning, I also noticed the use of flowers in first-class mail and the wallpaper of timepiece, yellow rose and rose ball, all made at the end of the 60s. Shells are also used in timepiece fuchsia rose in the 1966-67 Xerox books. And I wondered about the value or symbolism that flowers and shells might have for Smith, and I might ask her later. Keegan's other motif, shells, is often considered within the Black community as a symbol of immortality and as a mean of guiding the deceased in the afterlife, especially in the context of slavery. Shells bring the reading of Keegan montages into the sphere of the symbolic. To conclude, I would like to highlight the fact that using banal sort of office technology and turning it into a creative machine, I would like to propose sort of understanding Keegan's Xerox montages as sort of phoenix-like. As the colors are burned by the copy machine, they are reborn in all their wonder and capacities, in line with what Scott Herring named a queer xenography, regarding Keith Haring's practice. We can easily name Keegan's work as embodying a sort of intersectional feminist xerography of sorts, the result of a critical, radical, and personal practice of copying. And as I said in my introduction, Rita Keegan struggled to find her place in the New York or Californian art scenes in the 70s, and as a result decided to move to London in 1980. Since then, she has been named the godmother of black art by black British artist Keith Piper, yet Rita Keegan has been excluded from the official narratives made by art historians, but also often left out of alternative accounts made by black British male artists. As Igor Oweif-Sowinski, who later led the Rita Keegan Archive project, stated, Keegan has demonstrated pursuance, persistence, and resilience, and continued making works, even if rarely shown, regularly showed them nonetheless, even if in alternative venues, and above all, archived them all in the hope of later interest, research, and commentary. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers. Can I invite you all to come and sit down, and Barbara too, and we will have a little discussion. Thank you all so much for your presentations. Thank you, Barbara, so much for joining us. I wanted to start, obviously we've seen quite a range of different practices, but something we've been really interested in our sort of ongoing research and project is about how far the kind of standard secretary and Xerox's advertising of women as the operators of these machines provided a kind of foil for these women experimenters. So I guess my first question, which you can all weigh in on, is how much that was a sort of muse, the sexist stereotyping of the figure of secretary, and how perhaps it provided a path, instead of taking orders and fulfilling the needs of somebody else, instead fulfilling one's own needs. And perhaps I'll pass it first, the word first to Barbara.
Oh, and say again the question.
So how the kind of ideal, the figure of the secretary as the operator of the machine sort of provided inspiration for you versus, well, obviously, maybe not at all.
No, I never thought about making work as against the image of women as a secretary. Yeah, I didn't relate it to business at all because it just became a tool for me to make art. And I guess the reason I got into that was because, I don't know if you want me to tell the story now, but sorry? Okay, well, I went to Gemini, I think it's lithography, is that what they did? Anyways, it was a artist studio workshop business where they would bring artists in to make series of prints that they would then sell to the public and show in shows. And I thought, well, I had a wonderful drawing idea of and a lithograph is done on a stone. I mean, and the image is made on the stone in a oily ink. It's a whole thing, but the process is called planar, and because it doesn't bite into the stone and it doesn't lift off the stone, it's just on the same plane as the stone. And they roll it under a press, and the paper comes down, and the image is printed off of it. And so I went to Gemini with my idea for a great stone. It was whole play on the tombstone, so it's a stone on a stone and all this. And I thought it was such a super good idea. And they looked at me and said, well, you know, you don't have a gallery, do you? And they, in other words, well, you know, we have people waiting to work here as a backup, and who's and a famous artist, I can't think of his name right now, was
Albers.
currently, what?
It was Albers.
Yeah.
Albers.
Was working there, and so, and we don't know how long it was going to take. In other words, they were completely shining me on because they didn't know who I was at all. And so I left, and I was just miffed, and I was driving home, and I had learned a lot about the history of of artists, of great printmakers. In other words, printmaking as an art is really an offshoot of a piece of equipment that's used to give information to the public. And so, you know, etchings and engravings were done to announce whatever, wars or whatever, but certain artists would take them over and turn them into an art tool. And so, and I thought each era has their own famous artists that were working with a particular methodology. And so for lithography, we have Daumier and Kathy Kollwitz. And they made these great prints, but they were the anomaly. And so I thought, well, what is the art making, the information processing medium of our time? And I said, well, it's business machines. So then I thought, is there a business machine whose technology is unique? And because most of them, like a mimeograph and a ditto machine, those are all basically the same technologies of lithography and so forth. And so I researched all these machines, and it turns out that Xerox is completely unique because they don't use ink. They use this little bead of plastic, which is a toner, called a toner, and the print is photographically copies what's on the plate, and then it moves to another part of the machine, and it goes through a heat process called sintering, and it melts the little bead onto the paper. So that the technology is entirely different. And so I thought, so that's what I got. So I looked into Xerox, and that's how I got the machine.
I mean, I think it's, you know, printmaking looms very large, obviously, in Xerox, but then photography, and particularly in the way that you use Xerox, performance as well, and then, of course, the transformation into artist books. So this kind of intermediality and sort of intersection of different media, I think, comes across in all of the presentation. So I guess that's another question, maybe for Michelle and Taous, about where does Xerox fit in, and why the artists wanted to use photocopy in their work? You know, what possibilities did it offer to them?
To answer your first question, I will say that Joan was very aware of these sexist advertisements, and I think that she was consciously trying to upend those advertisements in her practice. And I think it's not a coincidence that she's picturing the feminine body on a machine that's traditionally associated with feminized labor. And then for your second question regarding intermediality, Rochester is a historically photographic community. East Bend Kodak Company was founded there. So this is a city that revolutionized the accessibility of photography. And there were also a wide range of other photographic companies that were based there, like photographic lens companies, photographic paper companies. So it was really this photographer's mecca. And then when Joan moved there, she moved there in 1960 with her husband, Nathan Lyons, who became a very major curator at the Eastman House, which I should also note was the oldest museum photography collection in the world. And she became, as she describes it, a fly on the wall to this photographic community in which Nathan was organizing these workshops in their home of photographers who were interested in contesting straight photography. So it was these photographers who were interested not in the image that is just like perfectly framed for you, but they were interested in calling attention to the surface. So they wanted to draw on the surface of the print. They wanted to sew into the surface of the print. So I think we can see how Joan, who's like observing all these strange photographic practices in Rochester, then turns this machine that's quite photographic, where it operates like a view camera and allows you to mess with the surface in the way that her colleagues are.
I guess for Rita's work, in a way, copying is only a phase. It's mid-80s, 85, 86, 80, not even 87, just 2 years. She had a wide practice between performance, painting, installation, textile. And at that time in her life in London, she was squatting, she didn't have a home, she didn't have a studio, and there was just this place where she could go, where they could have the copying machine available to her, and she could go and pay very little money, and just so it was sort of a way of being creative in a very sort of cheap, accessible way. I think there's a massive practical aspect to why she turned to copying, and she found it exhilarating and sort of exciting and fun, and she just had loads of fun with it, and then moved on to something else. It was just a moment in her life, I think, for like very practical reasons.
I wanted to also ask about time in these works, because it's something that came across in all of the different presentations about the sort of quality of time. There's this kind of idea of the art of immediacy. I think, Barbara, you also talk about it as this kind of immediate register. But then on the other hand, there's also this kind of slow playing out and intervention and sort of almost dissection of the media. So I wondered a little bit also in terms of the sort of leafing through, and in the case of what Pietro showed, the book almost as a sort of durational time piece that you kind of spend time over, all of these different kind of aspects of time that appear in the different works. So on the one hand, it's like immediate, and on the other, it could be very slow or drawn out or durational, or even time-based if you see it as like a performance.
Well, I hadn't started doing performances when I did these books, and I hadn't even thought of it. So it wasn't related, well, only in that I was, using my body. But they were not related in any other way, yeah.
You had done already the black glass paintings, though, right?
Yes.
At that point. Do you see any connection between the Xerox work and the black glass paintings? I've always wondered. In the sense of, a reflecting surface, the black glass being maybe...
No.
No.
I never thought of it.
We see more than...
Wait, that's a good idea.
A glass surface you somewhat perform in front.
Yeah.
Or on top of.
Yeah, that's true.
I think of Joan's practice as a resistant slowness, especially when we think about it in relation to this capitalist enterprise of the Xerox machine, how it's a machine that's created to be efficient and productive. And it's created at the same time as all of these scientific efficiency studies in which companies are analyzing how to most efficiently use a machine, and actually the standard equipment is studied to see how it can be most efficiently used. Apparently, it can be used in 1.5 minutes, which I don't believe. But anyway, so I think that when we think about her using this machine, not this slow machine, as laboriously as possible, I think of it as in resistance to this workplace desire for efficiency, that she's choosing to use it slowly over the course of an entire day. And so just for instance, the one work that I showed before, she would have spent an entire day making it. So that's very much in contrast to Barbara's practice, where she probably could have gone through a whole ream of paper in one day with the Xerox machine.
One thing about, I'm forgetting what I was going to say. Time, I was going to talk about. It'll come back.
We can come back. I think I remember in the copy art community, there was this kind of alternatives are possible to capitalism, and that the photocopies had always been used in the service of capitalism, and that there was this other opportunity to use the medium for something else.
Copy art was very much a radical sort of collective and sort of community. But I think thinking about time in terms of Rita's work, there's two ways of looking at it. There's the possibility of going there and spending a couple hours and then taking her copies, putting them in a folder and moving on to something else. And then I would also like to suggest another way at sort of looking at time in her work is to sort of dialogue with her family and different generations, and being able to go back to the US in a way, go back to like travel sort of history and time, and sort of finding a way of sort of owning it and sort of making it hers. I think there's something about sort of time in sort of linked to history there that would be quite interesting to explore in Rita's work.
I wanna, oh, sorry.
I remember. What?
Oh, you remember, great. You go.
Yeah, well, the thing about the Xerox machine is that, I started, when I got it, I had these certain ideas, like those poetry sets, I was going to do that, and then there's certain things that turned out to be sculpture, which they didn't show. I was going to do that, and when I started working, the machine became like the salt cellar at the bottom of the sea. It just cranks out. It's endless. I just couldn't stop. And I'd go around my house and I'd find all these weird little things. Oh, wonder what that would look like. And so I just could not stop working on it. And in fact, I was telling my husband, I don't know how are we going to ever stop this?
Didn't he just tell you to send it back?
He said, call them up and tell them to come and pick it up. So, yeah, that was what I wanted.
Did you want to say something?
Well, just thinking a little bit more about time, I was thinking also about the choice of calling the book Coffins, which is quite significant both in terms of your family history, being your father being a second generation mortician and funerary home director, but also in the relation with the history of your family and what was going on in your personal life at that moment and the breakage of your marriage. So, and the logo you designed for the books, that you talked about as representing a moment in time where you reach kind of a point in which there's somewhat no turning back. And
there's no answer. You don't know. I mean,
yeah.
there's certain times in your life where everything comes to complete stop, and there, you don't know. It's sort of like nothing that you know to do, and so that's what this was. The coffins for that. Yeah.
We're running a little short on time because we started late, and we want to make sure that there is time for people to go on the tours. But I wanted to open up to see if there's any questions. I see a question from Sally. Should I bring the... Oh, I think there's someone to bring you a microphone. Mm-hmm. It will be, yeah.
Yeah, it works. First of all, this is a great event, and the auditorium should be completely full because this is so exciting. I think it was Pietro who brought up early the question of Ruchet and his books, but I was thinking, looking at the imagery of Rauschenberg and the whole idea of the Combine, but I suddenly realized, I don't know when, I mean, Warhol, of course, came out here, but was Rauschenberg's work seen out here? Did he come out here? And were you interested in Rauschenberg's collaging and combines? And
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't know if it directly related, but yeah.
And I was so interested also in hearing about the machines coming into the house or the studio, because it reminded me of this whole 19th century notion of the machine in the garden, meaning the railroad, but this is like the new business machine coming into the house. And then the way it got reappropriated, it seems, by women more. I also would love to hear a little more about Sonia Sheridan, who was also working in upstate New York as well, but there's not enough time.
You'll have to follow after the research project. Yeah. Well, are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for thinking so. Yeah, I think we'll draw it to a close just because we want to get onto the tours. But thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Barbara, for being here. Thank you, Pietro and Michelle and Taous, for your presentations.
Well, thank you so much for all of this.